Beware the middleman, how your two-factor authentication can be compromised. Hi everyone, Leo Notenboom here for AskLeo.com. In a recent article and video, I discussed some of the different ways that two-factor authentication can, in fact, be compromised, and which ones are the most resilient. I need to explain one of those techniques in a little bit more detail because it targets one of the more pragmatic and popular forms of two-factor authentication, that being the Google Authenticator compatible two-factor authentication. The good news here is that it only works with your help. As you can imagine, though, it is also one of those situations where you need to know that you're helping, or at least know that you could be participating in order to thwart this problem. So what it boils down to is simply this. It relies on phishing. In other words, you get an email that looks like it is from one of the companies that you use. Of course, when you get there, you need to sign in. You'll provide your username and your password. But since this is a phishing attempt, then the username and password that you now provide end up being saved or captured by the hacker who has established or set up this particular trap. Now, in the case of two-factor authentication, what this relies on is somebody in the middle. It's typically called a man-in-the-middle attack. So far, all we've seen is a pretty traditional phishing attack that attempts to collect your username and password. However, if that website that you are trying to sign into, that fake hacker-provided website that looks like what you expect but isn't the real site, if the hacker is there in real time watching this information come in, and when they then immediately try to sign in to the real service using your credentials, if they suddenly get a two-factor prompt, then what they do is immediately send that two-factor prompt back to you. Again, you don't know that this isn't the real website. You think you're signing into the website you expect. And indeed, you get your username and your password, and all of a sudden you're faced with a two-factor prompt. No big deal. This happens all the time. But in this case now, when you provide your two-factor code from your Google Authenticator compatible device, that code is instead given to the hacker, who then again, in real time, while you're doing this, enters it into their attempt to sign into the real service. So, an example. You get a phishing email that asks you to sign into Google, offers you some kind of an issue that you need to resolve with Google. You click on the link without realizing that it's not really taking you to Google. However, when you get there, it looks like Google. It looks like a Google sign-on page. You enter your username and your password, you hit submit. You then get a two-factor authentication request. You enter your code, and all three of those things then, your username, your password, and the two-factor code, have now been handed off to the hacker, who can then indeed sign in as you using your second factor because you've given it to them. It has to work in real time. In other words, the hacker has to be actively looking at what you're doing as you're doing it, because as we know, these two-factor codes are time limited. They're called time-based one-time passwords. They change every 30 seconds, and there's no predictability as to what they're going to change into. But for that 30-second window, the hacker has the opportunity to slurp up what you type in as the second factor and then immediately type it into the real service and sign in as yours. Again, this all relies on phishing. So like I said, you have to kind of sort of fall victim to phishing in order for this to even be a thing. So of course, the first solution, if you want to call it that, is, well, Don't do that, right? Avoid phishing. Now, that's easier said than done. I'm not really trying to be flip about this. I understand that phishing attempts can be sometimes very, very convincing, but it's very important to pay attention to these kinds of things. The most common piece of advice, of course, is to never click a link in email. If somebody is presenting you with an email that says, hey, your Google account has an issue, click on this link to fix the issue, don't click on the link. Instead, go over to your browser, go to your Google account, and see if the issue is even there. If it's not, well, you probably just avoided a phishing attempt. Now, the second solution to this problem is to use a hardware key instead of a Google Authenticator compatible device. And the reason is actually very simple. The hardware key is, in fact, something you have to have physically in your possession. It is literally a second factor that proves you are in possession of something. And in order to use it, you have to insert it, press a button, and there's nothing that you have the ability to hand off to a man in the middle for them to be able to make use of this in any way. So, if you really are concerned about this situation, a two-factor key, like a YubiKey or many others, is one way to completely insulate yourself from this type of two-factor compromise caused by a man-in-the-middle form of attack. In general, most of us don't have to do this. I know that I tend to use Google Authenticator all the time, but that does rely on my ability to understand what is and is not a phishing attempt. As long as you can do that, you're safe. For updates, for comments, for links related to this topic and more, visit askleo.com/169710. I'm Leo Notenboom, and this is AskLeo.com. Thanks for watching.